Jovaughn Gwyn could be Falcons offensive line coach Dwayne Ledford's secret project and plan B if center Drew Dalman doesn't work out.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank each and every one of you that makes us your first listen. Make sure you follow in the footsteps of the everydayers out there that check out this illustrious podcast each and every day by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today, the day has finally arrived that we are wrapping up my film breakdown, scouting reports, whatever you want to call them, of the Falcons 2023 NFL draft class, wrapping things up with 7th round offensive lineman, guard / center out of South Carolina, Jovaughn Gwyn, and we'll break down what I think Gwyn could be here in Atlanta, whether or not he has the potential to push a player like Drew Dalman for the starting center position, maybe be in the mix at the guard position. So we'll break all of that down on today's episode. But first, let's get a little background information on Jovaughn Gwyn. Hails from the Charlotte area, was a 4-star recruit out of high school. From what I've read, kind of narrowed down his 2 final choices to South Carolina and NC State. NC State happened to have an offensive line coach by the name of, what was his name? Dwayne Ledford. I think he's currently the offensive line coach of the Atlanta Falcons, I've heard. Maybe you guys have heard of him. But, you know, all that sarcasm aside, it does feel like because Dwayne Ledford was, recruited Jovaughn Gwyn so many years ago, like this was kind of like led, Coach Led, as they call him. We're not going to call him D-Led because there's only one D-Led in the world. But Coach Ledford was kind of pounding the table for Jovaughn Gwyn. And it's kind of similar to, what we talked about last time with DeMarco Hellams, who overlapped with a couple of Falcons assistants while he was at Alabama. And so maybe that's something that we'll keep an eye on in the future for like these 7th round picks, where these are just kind of like, hey, there's a coach on staff that is like, I know this guy, draft this kid. He's a talented player. And what Jovaughn Gwyn showed at South Carolina, he was a 4-year starter at right guard for them, played over 3,000 snaps at that right guard position, did dabble as a left guard for 15 snaps as a freshman, then I think played 1 as a junior. So 16 total snaps as a left guard, according to PFF, and then 14 career snaps at center, the position he's likely to transition to here in Atlanta, and the expectation is, and all 14 of those snaps came in South Carolina's bowl game this past year against Notre Dame, and he played basically 2 series from what I could tell at that center position. Don't exactly know why, because they just switched him and the guy who had been starting the entire year at center to right guard for like 2 series. But watching those 2 series, the first series was kind of rough because his shotgun snaps were very low. But then the second, as he continued to snap more, and with the second series, it was a non-issue. So that's a very positive sign that he was basically within a dozen or so snaps able to figure out the snapping issue. So that I don't think that's going to be a huge transition for him in the pros, learning how to snap. He did get some reps at the NFLPA Bowl and the Senior Bowl at the center position. He was a late Senior Bowl addition. I believe he was replacing Ohio State offensive tackle DeJuan Jones on the 3rd day of practices there. I did go back and watch both the NFLPA Bowl and the Senior Bowl to watch him in the game. I thought he played really well in the games. I wasn't on hand for the NFLPA practices. I was on hand for the Senior Bowl practice, and my recollection, and then going back and watching a couple of the one-on-ones, it was a little up and down for him in those one-on-ones, but I can only assume that he played well in the NFLPA practices because he was one of 3 offensive linemen drafted from that game. Gwyn wound up measuring in at 6'2", 297 at the combine, 31 3/4-inch arms, which is 3rd percentile for a guard, slightly better for a center, 13th percentile arm length for a center position. Ran well for the center position, 79th percentile 40 time, 87th percentile in a broad jump. Also had a really impressive bench press. His agilities weren't great, right? 33rd percentile, 3-cone, 20th percentile short shuttle. But because of the impressive numbers in other areas, his relative athletic score, his RAS, whatever you want to call it, was pretty high, 7.81 for a guard, 7.39 for a center. But when I watched the film, despite his good athletic testing, that indicates that, he's a 70th percentile athlete or above on the interior. If I would have guessed based off of watching the film, I probably would have assumed that he was closer to like 50th percentile. He's not a bad athlete, but it just seemed more average to me than a plus athlete that, being in the 70th percentile would suggest. And we'll talk about how those limitations in terms of athleticism manifest in his game later on in today's episode. But let's talk about the positives that he brings. And I think the biggest positive that Jovaughn Gwyn brings to the table is mean streak, right? Is that ability to finish, to play to and through the whistle. Our good buddy Justin Tuck, as he labeled Joe Hawley back in the day, would label Jovaughn Gwyn as a dirtbag. And, that's an affectionate term, at least among offensive players when it comes to offensive linemen. Defensive players may feel very differently about that. But I would even argue that Gwyn's mean streak and his ability to finish plays, if you go back and look at the last 10 offensive linemen that the Falcons have drafted, which goes all the way back to, I think, Wes Schweitzer in the 2016 draft, I think you can make a pretty compelling argument, and I certainly probably would make that argument. Maybe it's recency bias, but that Jovaughn Gwyn has the meanest streak of any of those guys. He's the nastiest of the offensive linemen that the Falcons have drafted over the last 7-8 drafts, right? Another thing that stood out about Gwyn's film was that he did a good job adjusting to stunts, right? And that gets us to, some of the issues and some of the positives he had in pass protection, where I watched 7 games or charted 7 games and saw him lose about 13 reps where he gave up a pressure or a sack or something like that. And only about 2 of those, so about 15% of those losses came due to either speed or power, right? Most of his losses, about 60% of them, came off of stunts, right? And even though I just said he was good at adjusting them, it was that he was good at adjusting to them to the point that he was able to at least, redirect those guys off of those stunts to prevent sacks. And they wind up going wide of the quarterback. And that is a skill, right? That is a skill and we've seen over the years that the Falcons have had issues picking up stunts on certain aspects of their offensive line. So that to me speaks to, Gwyn playing with a little bit more awareness than you typically see at the collegiate level. Now, about 23% of his losses came off of pass rush moves, technique, and most of that was, swim moves, right? And that's a factor, and we'll talk a little bit more about how his playing style when it comes to pass protection leads to him being a little bit more susceptible to swim moves. So my concern with him is the power and the speed is going to be different at the NFL level. So he'll be more susceptible to that, as well as those swim moves, than necessarily the stunts. But it was very clear to me that the vast majority of he didn't lose that many one-on-one reps. And that was something that stood out on film. We'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons behind that. But, I think in terms of his pass protection ability, he does anchor reasonably well, right? He does have good hand placement and good punching power, right? He does have good enough feet to mirror. So he kind of checks all the boxes you need to be an effective pass protector. I do think there still are going to be physical limitations that he's going to have to overcome. And so therefore, all of these things, the anchor, the hand placement, the footwork, these things are going to be things that need to be refined even more to overcome these physical limitations. And we'll talk about those limitations coming up on today's episode. We'll talk about whether or not the move to center will help or hide some of these limitations as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets. Even if your first bet doesn't win, you can't lose. So head on over to FanDuel to bet on Major League Baseball, or you can bet on whatever you want, right? You can bet on the upcoming NBA draft and see who you think is going to be, probably not the number one pick, because that seems like a lock, but 2 through 13 to fill out the lottery, who the Hawks are going to take, right? You can also bet on the upcoming NFL season. You can bet on tennis. You can bet on Bijan Robinson winning Offensive Player of the Year. You can bet on golf. It's all available at America's #1 sportsbook. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and you'll get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. So when we talk about Jovaughn Gwyn and some of those limitations, and the main thing that really stood out about Jovaughn Gwyn on film was he tends to rely very heavily on jump sets. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with jump sets, think of it as normally offensive linemen are taught to be reactive when it comes to pass protection and building that pocket, right? And jump sets is basically an offensive lineman being proactive and attacking the defensive lineman before that, right? We love our historic analogies here on Locked On Falcons. We talk about, how defense and offense relate to like castle sieges in the past. And, all of that is owed to the fact that I have a degree in history and then a recession hit. And that degree basically became worth less than the paper it was printed on. And I guess I was like, hey, I guess I should get into podcasting. That might be a real thing in the future. And here we are. But, I do love to occasionally dust off that history degree every now and then on the podcast to get some usage out of it. And the way I would liken, offensive line and pass protection, as you guys probably are familiar with, it's like forming a shield wall, right? Where you're a bunch of guys, out there trying to keep the quarterback clean and keep the defensive line, the attackers, from getting through that line through your shields and sort of interlocking shields, phalanx, all that sort of stuff, right? We're not going to go too deep into that. But jump set is basically you deciding to, forget the shield wall. I'm just going to go and attack the defensive lineman by going forward rather than going backwards. And it is a useful tool in an NFL offensive lineman's arsenal, right? We talked about this when we did the Chris Lindstrom scouting report many years ago, how Chris Lindstrom relied heavily on jump setting, even though he didn't need to, because of how good an athlete he was and all this various things, that he could just do traditional pass protection. But I don't think that's the case with Jovaughn Gwyn, right? He tends to have to need to rely on jump setting, and that's where the arm length concerns shows up, right? Because, having short arms on the offensive line is less meaningful when you're an interior player like Jovaughn Gwyn is projected to be versus when you're an offensive tackle, right? That's a reason why everybody was talking about Northwestern tackles, Peter Skoronsky, say kick him inside the guard. This is, to me, a factor in why Caleb McGarry struggled so much in his first couple of years, due to his short arms playing on the outside. And, fortunately, there aren't as many good long D tackles in the NFL as there are, edge rushers that can really exploit that weaknesses when you have short arms. But there are plenty of players, there's Chris Jones is the obvious example. Obviously, there aren't many guys like Chris Jones walking around, but there are a lot more guys that are built like Chris Jones in the NFL than there are that you see in college, even if you're playing in the SEC like Jovaughn Gwyn. And that was something that was notable about Gwyn, that when you saw him against some of the premium competition in the SEC, the Georgia D tackles over the last couple of years, Javon Dexter at Florida, another one of those long D tackles, it got exposed a little bit. And so what that does is Jovaughn Gwyn forces to jump set guys, because he knows if that defender gets the initiative, right, and can sort of, attack him first, right, that arm length is going to be a problem for Jovaughn Gwyn, and it puts him at a disadvantage. So he counters that by being aggressive, being proactive, and hitting the defensive lineman before they can hit him. And that's effective in college because you're facing, lesser talent, unrefined pass rushers, guys that don't necessarily have a pass rush plan. But when you get to the NFL, especially if you're going to be a starter in the NFL, you're facing a bunch of guys that do have all of those boxes checked, rushing with a plan, being refined, all that stuff. And those NFL defensive tackles are going to do a thing that some of the college defensive tackles were successfully able to do, which is hit him with that quick swim move when he tries to jump set you, right? And that was something where he didn't give up a ton of pressure to swim moves, as I noted earlier, but that swim move was consistently effective against him when guys were able to disengage from his blocks a number of times when they use that swim move because of his tendency to rely on that jump set. And so that can be a problem for him, at the next level. Now, the good thing about Jovaughn Gwyn moving to center is that these issues that we're talking about that could, rear their ugly head in the NFL should be less of an issue at center than they are at guard, right? Because a center is going to have less situations where they're blocking one-on-one against a defensive tackle than a guard is going to have. And that was what was interesting about watching this film at South Carolina, because there weren't that many instances in my eyes, that even though Gwyn was a guard, that he was kind of ISO'd one-on-one in pass protection, right? That a lot of times, he would go and slide to the center to help out that guy against the nose tackle. And I think some of that's owed to the fact that a lot of college teams, and this is less an issue in the SEC than it is elsewhere in college football, but a lot of college teams use three-man fronts, right? And so you would have a nose tackle lined up over the center, a defensive end lined up over the right tackle. And a lot of times Jovaughn Gwyn was kind of sitting there, trying to make a decision of, do I slide to help the center or do I slide to help my right tackle? And more often than not, he seemed to slide to help the center. And he'll be in a similar situation playing center in the NFL, where he'll have the guard potentially slide to him, or he'll slide to protect the guard, because he's going to face far more four-man fronts in the NFL than probably he did in college. And so that could be an issue if he's at guard than it was at center. But I do think he can function as a guard if like an injury happens and you need an emergency fill-in for a game or two, right? He can be a functional starter for you at that guard spot, but I think his limitations are going to show up a lot more at that guard position than they will at center. I still think he'll get exposed from time to time at center, especially when he's facing some of the beefier, nose tackles, some of the longer guys in the league, but it should be at least less so at the center position than it is at the guard position. Now, the other issue I had with Jovaughn Gwyn's film, and we talked about some of the positives he brings in pass protection, I wasn't that impressed with his run blocking, right? Although I do think this is an area that can get it better, but he didn't consistently fire off the ball in order to get that leverage against the run. And despite being a shorter guy, guys were able to get under him because he didn't necessarily fire off the ball. And he needs to be a guy that kind of fires off the ball. And that was, comparing him to Matthew Bergeron, that was something that Bergeron consistently did, was coming off the ball with, intensity and authority and whatnot. But Gwyn has to be that more of that guy, because he doesn't necessarily have the size or power to create movement alone off of that. And part of the reason why he doesn't create movement is because Gwyn does not do a good job driving his feet once he does make that contact, right? That, run blocking is essentially, particularly for the interior guys, you have 300-pound guys colliding in a collision, and whether, they go one way or the other is kind of dependent on who's the guy that not necessarily wins the initial contact, although that helps. It's that ability to churn your feet and drive your legs to create that subsequent movement after that initial clash. And so, the way that Gwyn is a run blocker, he's more of a guy that's getting in the way. He's getting position as opposed to, creating movement and opening holes for guys. And that's fine, especially in the outside zone scheme. Like, that's more of a, you got to get position. And so he has the tools to get better there and improve there, but you would like to see a little bit more, power and movement skills to not only lock on to those defensive linemen, but then move them off the ball, because he's driving his feet and he just kind of just sits there and holds it and just holds the block as opposed to trying to get movement. But that's something I think can be coached up. Certainly here with the emphasis that we put on the running game should be coached up. The other thing that should get coached up for him is his ability on the second level, playing in the outside zone scheme. You've heard me in the past liken, particularly on the interior guys, the centers, the guard, those guys have to be heat-seeking missiles to hit those linebackers on the second level, to climb to the second level, hit those linebackers, create those extra creases that will help turn, a 4-yard gain into an 8-yard gain or a 10-yard gain, and potentially more if the running back can break multiple tackles. Bijan. And so you need that in this blocking scheme. And Gwyn's second level blocking was a little underwhelming. It wasn't bad or anything, but it was just a little underwhelming. And so that's another area that I think he has to get better. And I think that's where the lack of change of direction, the lack of agility that showed up in his testing manifests itself on the field, because when it comes to linebackers, they're not just standing there waiting for to get engulfed at the point of attack by a 300-pound offensive lineman like they're, one of the Ghosts in Pac-Man. They're moving around, right? So you have to be able to hit a moving target, and Gwyn did not necessarily do a great job of that. But I do think as he gets more comfortable in this blocking scheme and gets coached up, these are things that will get better. Like, I feel like the run blocking stuff can get improvement with refinement, with technical and development. The pass protection issues, as I mentioned before, some of that is just owed to physical limitations that aren't going to necessarily go away. But this gets to the heart of the Dwayne Ledford conversation, right? Because I don't expect Gwyn to come in right away and be an impact player, but I'm very interested to see where Jovaughn Gwyn is, with development, in years 3, in year 4 and beyond, because we know that that's typically around the time where offensive linemen take a little bit longer to develop than some other positions. And that's when year 3, year 4 is usually when those guys start to hit their stride. And I'm very curious to see, with Dwayne Ledford, getting him that development, will we see Jovaughn Gwyn make a significant jump? Because he's able to refine some of the technical elements. He's able to compensate for some of his physical limitations, right? And this is where you have to buy into the makeup and the person and the intangibles and all these various things. And that's what makes projecting these players, particularly long-term, hard, because, me sitting here talking on the internet, like, I don't really know about these things. And that's something that the teams are supposed to know. And you want to give the team the benefit of the doubt, but you just never know with the type of player. And so I think, Gwyn is the type of offensive lineman that coaches like Dwayne Ledford love, because he possesses those high level intangibles and whatnot. And so while I don't expect Jovaughn Gwyn to really push Drew Dalman in year 1 and probably not even in year 2, for that starting position, it is notable that Drew Dalman's contract does run out after 2 years. He will become a free agent entering the 2025 offseason, coming off of the 2024 season. And if the Falcons decide that Drew Dalman is not worth giving a second contract because he doesn't necessarily develop at that point, I could easily kind of see Dwayne Ledford coming in and be like, I got this guy, Jovaughn Gwyn, that we've been developing for the last couple of years. Why not give him a shot to be that long-term asset at the center position? And while I don't sit here and project Gwyn to be a more talented or a better player than Drew Dalman, in part due to it, I think Dalman doesn't have the same, athletic limitations that Gwyn has, in part due to Dalman being a much better second level blocker and whatnot, and being a little bit more able to make some of the reach blocks and be that agile player that you kind of like in the outside zone scheme. I wouldn't completely write off the idea that Gwyn could turn into a better player if he puts in the time, if he puts in the work to become more reliable, more consistent. And Dwayne Ledford is in his bag, as they say, coaching him up. And so, I do think Gwyn has a number of issues to overcome, but because I have so much faith in Dwayne Ledford, I'm much more open to Gwyn potentially turning into a decent starter in the NFL than I probably would have, and certainly would have been a couple of years ago, or certainly probably a year ago, before, Dwayne Ledford really got into his bag this past season. So that'll be something curious to keep an eye on. We'll wrap up today's episode talking about, some of the players that I will compare Jovaughn Gwyn to, talking about his ceiling, talking about his floor. And of course, I got to compare him to some former Falcon center. Is it going to be Todd McClure? Is it going to be Ben Garland? Is it going to be Joe Hawley? Well, it's going to actually be none of the above, spoiler alert. And so find out who that player will be as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But first, I want to, give a shout out to the everydayers out there that make this illustrious podcast their first listen. Follow in their footsteps by subscribing on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're checking us out on YouTube and you're an everydayer, please leave us a comment and let me know that you're an everydayer. So wrapping up today's episode with my NFL player comps, and I do this with floor, ceiling, and eye level. And a floor to me is what a player is immediately entering the NFL. The ceiling is what their max potential is, 4 or 5 years down the road. And the eye level is what I think is, halfway between the floor and the ceiling. And to me, what is going to be the most accurate projection for what a player is going to be, because they'll likely get some development, but may not necessarily get all the development that they need to be the quote unquote best case scenario moving forward. So my floor for Jovaughn Gwyn is former Falcon center J.C. Hassenauer. And some of you are like, J.C. who? Right? Well, J.C. Hassenauer was an undrafted free agent out of Alabama for the Falcons back in 2018, did not make the roster that summer, went to the AAF the following year. And wound up being a productive starter there, and then landed with the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2020. And the last couple of years has been a solid backup center for them, has filled in for underwhelming starters, have been a solid backup for at injuries, has even dabbled as a guard when there has been injuries there as an emergency option, and has at best been serviceable as a guard, but has been solid as a backup center. In fact, a couple of years ago was an upgrade over Kendrick Green, a player that I liked a lot in that 2021 draft. And so that speaks to, even though my batting average with evaluating offensive linemen is high, it is certainly not 1,000 because of that Kendrick Green miss. But I think like Hassenauer, Jovaughn Gwyn early in his career should be an effective backup center that can at least dabble as a guard if need be, if you find yourself in a pinch. Now, I'm kind of cheating a little bit with this projection of a floor because I'm not necessarily believing that Jovaughn Gwyn week one is going to give you the same value that J.C. Hassenauer, now with like 5-6 years of development, is going to give you, day one. This is more a comp to what J.C. Hassenauer was a couple of years ago when he first got to Pittsburgh. So it's kind of more of a poor man's J.C. Hassenauer rather than the fully formed version of J.C. Hassenauer that exists today. But that still is a guy that I think is a competent backup, a serviceable emergency guard. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, my ceiling comparison for Jovaughn Gwyn is David Andrews, and I use this comp a couple of years ago with Drew Dalman. I think it fits a little bit better with Andrews just because, I think Dalman's a little bit more athletic than both Andrews and Gwyn are, but all three of those guys, win because of smarts and toughness and intangibles, not necessarily Dalman's a good athlete, but he's a small athlete, right? And the same is true of Andrews and Gwyn, and they're less athletic, in my opinion, than Drew Dalman was. But, Andrews has gone on to start 7 out of the last 8 years for the Patriots at center, undrafted free agent out of Georgia. At his peak has been graded out, according to PFF, as like a top 5 center, but most years is still top 10, top 15 guy. I can see with development, if Jovaughn Gwyn, if Dwayne Ledford's in his bag, he's turning water into wine, all that stuff and more, I could see Jovaughn Gwyn kind of being probably maybe not exactly like a top 5 center like David Andrews has been at his peak, but a guy that's maybe like in the top 12, right? An above average starter. And, Andrews is interesting because he's been this sort of rock solid piece for the better part of a decade in New England. But when you think about some of the good offensive linemen that played for the Patriots in that period of time, he's usually not one of the first names that comes to mind. I know for me, he's not, right? And you're looking at, those guys that do come to mind are Joe Tooney and Shaq Mason and Marcus Cannon and Trent Brown and Michael Onwenu and some of those guys. But meanwhile, David Andrews, is that rock, that anchor in the middle of that offensive line for all those units. And I think you can see you're hoping for with Jovaughn Gwyn a similar dynamic, right? Where moving forward, he could be the Falcons starting center, 5 years from now. And when you think about the good offensive linemen on the Falcons, you think of Chris Lindstrom and Matthew Bergeron, and maybe not 5 years from now, in the meantime, you think about Jake Matthews, but 5 years from now, I'm assuming that the Falcons will hopefully find a replacement for a quality replacement for Jake Matthews at left tackle and potentially as well at right tackle for Caleb McGarry. And so those are kind of the guys that you think about when you think about, in the future when the Falcons have a very good offensive line, but quietly like David Andrews, Jovaughn Gwyn is just kind of that rock solid, veteran leader, set tone setter with his toughness and his mean streak and all that sort of stuff. And you're kind of hoping that, Dwayne Ledford can be our Dante Scarnecchia, as Scarnecchia, was key in developing a player like David Andrews and making him into as effective a player. And you're kind of hoping Dwayne Ledford can kind of do the same thing with Jovaughn Gwyn. So that's where that comp kind of comes from. But in reality, my more accurate projection of what I think it's more likely that Jovaughn Gwyn is going to be is my eye level projection. And that is Pat Elflein, formerly of the Carolina Panthers, formerly of the Minnesota Vikings. Elflein was also a questionable athlete coming out of Ohio State in 2017, but was a very high character player coming out of a major program that led to him being a 3rd round pick. He was a day 1 starter for the Vikings back in 2017, had a pretty solid rookie season, but then injuries hit in the following year and he struggled. They drafted Garrett Bradbury to upgrade that spot in 2019. debatable whether or not they accomplished that mission. And they moved Elflein to guard to play next to Bradbury in 2019. And he continued to struggle in that position, and then was cut by the Vikings in 2020, scooped up by the Jets. In the last 2 years, has played with the Panthers. I think he's currently a free agent. And basically, what I'm projecting Gwyn to be like Elflein, which is a guy that is a capable backup center, capable backup guard, right? That ideal game day option that can be plugged and played, in the event of an injury, but not a guy that you necessarily want to start, right? That's kind of what Elflein is. It's like if you're starting Pat Elflein, you don't want to start him, but if you need to start him because of injuries, you'll be able to live with that. And so it's a backup that you like, but he's very limited as a starter. And that to me is what I think Jovaughn Gwyn is likely to be, that sort of more career backup type of player. But if you do start him, like we saw with Pat Elflein multiple times in Minnesota, as well as in Carolina the last couple of years, if he's a starter for you, you're very likely to bring in some veteran or some premium draft pick to upgrade that spot the very next year because of Gwyn's limitations as a starter, but is an quote unquote ideal sort of backup. And so when I'm projecting what I expect out of Jovaughn Gwyn over the next couple of years, right? I'm expecting him to make the roster this year. I know when we drafted him, I was skeptical of that at the time. I'm less skeptical of that now. I do think he'll probably be that ninth offensive lineman on the 53-man roster. That's probably going to lead to him being inactive most weeks unless there's an injury. And my suspicion is next year, regardless of whether Hennessy starts this year or not, the Falcons are probably going to let Hennessy walk in free agency at that left guard center position. And Gwyn is a natural to sort of slide into the vacant, emergency interior offensive line backup option that can play center or guard in a pinch on game day, with presumably Matthew Bergeron locking down that left guard position long term. And then the following year, that will be Drew Dalman's contract year, 2024, that is. And then, if he doesn't earn a second contract, right, and that will be the question, in that 2024 year, is it time to give Drew Dalman a second deal? And if they do, then, Gwyn will remain that backup for the next couple of years that he is, has been through the end of his rookie contract through the 2026 season, I believe. And if they don't keep Dalman in 2025, then I could see them signing or drafting somebody else to replace Dalman and then asking him and Gwyn to compete for the starting spot. And that's an opportunity where Jovaughn Gwyn could basically, win that camp battle potentially. And of course, whether he keeps that job at that point, will depend on how he plays and whatnot. And I'm not going to necessarily go on a limb and predict how Jovaughn Gwyn's going to perform in 2025 and 2026 at this point in time in 2023. We'll worry about that in 2025 and 2026. So that's kind of my sort of rough outline on projection on what I think the direction that Jovaughn Gwyn is going. Obviously, there are going to be some unforeseen circumstances like injuries and whatnot that may, cause things to veer off to the left or right or whatever and take a detour, but we'll just sort of have to see how that goes. But I do think Jovaughn Gwyn is a adequate backup. There are some limitations that I think early in his career, if he's forced to play significant times, will get exposed. But I think if he gets the time in the Dwayne Ledford Academy for a couple of years to sort of really refine and fine-tune his game, then I do think he can work out some of the weaker aspects of his game and turn into a serviceable starter at the very least in the Pat Elflein mold, but with the potential that if he really, graduates magna cum laude or whatever from the Dwayne Ledford Academy, I'm making all this stuff up as I go, guys, as you can tell, then you could see him maybe turning into an above average starter at the center position. So we'll just see what happens with Jovaughn Gwyn. That is a wrap for the Falcons 2023 draft class. I don't know if we're going to do that much, on the undrafted free agents, but I'll check out a couple of those guys over the next couple of days. Now that I don't have, it's like sitting here like I got to watch some film at something. Who am I going to watch? So maybe I'll watch some of those guys. But I know later this week we'll probably talk a little NFC South stuff, right? We haven't spent that much time worrying about the rest of the teams in the NFC South, so that's probably on deck for you guys. Later this week. Which day exactly, don't know, but I'll figure it out, guys. But that is it for us on today's Locked On Falcons. Really appreciate you guys tuning in. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think about your thoughts on Jovaughn Gwyn in this projection, as well as hit me up via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And of course, you can hit me up in the Locked On Falcons Discord, a link in the description below. Guys, really appreciate you guys for tuning in to Locked On Falcons. Continue to make us your first listen each and every day. And for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL podcast to get the lowdown on the other 31 teams and what they are doing as they get geared up for training camp. And that's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.